Welcome back to our lecture series on reporting and presenting data for qualitative research. And given that I just talked about storytelling in the last lecture, why don't I start this one off with another story? So I'm going to tell you a story about something that was going on when I was a kid growing up. And that was something that's detailed in the book Console Wars by Blake Harris, where there were two companies that were fighting for the hearts and minds of America's youth through a category that I, of course, know and love: video games. So in the 1980s, Nintendo of America became a major player in the world of video games, and they had a firm control on the market from the production channels to the distribution channels to the retail channels. They insisted on a kid-friendly image for everything, and they sold video games not as electronics, but as toys in stores like Toys R Us and KB Toys. Now, Nintendo was, of course, a Japanese company that had a foothold in North America, and one of their biggest competitors in Japan was a company called Sega, who'd been trying to gain a bigger foothold in the North American market, and who'd started to see some success in the early 1990s with their Sega Genesis video game console. Around this time, Sega started going after Nintendo very aggressively with an edgy ad campaign that was geared at the tween-aged and teenage gamer segment, kids who had grown up on Nintendo who were getting older. And they went on to actually match Nintendo's market share in North America and they even became a huge force in Europe where Nintendo had very little presence. A lot of this was due to the man that's pictured here. His name's Tom Kalinske, and he was a former toy industry executive who'd worked for Mattel in revolutionizing the Barbie doll line from being just dolls with hair to brush into more exciting toys that were capable of more sophisticated play. And he'd also helped launch the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe line of toys. Now, He-Man came out with a lot of marketing research that Kalinske had done, learning that young boys were really interested in fantasy and Conan the Barbarian style characters, but also in the ideas of transformation and power. The idea of having these big muscular guys that could defeat evil was something that really appealed to young boys at the time, and he learned that through listening to them and talking to them and conducting qualitative research. This led to the creation of not only one of the most successful toy lines in history, but also the toy line that launched the whole idea of a syndicated cartoon show centered around extending the toys into an entertainment property. This is a guy who really knew how to listen and learn through qualitative research and then to turn those ideas into products that people desperately wanted. So in the 1990s, he was brought on to lead Sega of America, and Sega was going through a transition where they needed to bring in a new advertising agency to help promote their Sega Genesis console and also make a big deal about their new mascot, who is this character here, whose name's Sonic the Hedgehog. They decided to give 3 different advertising agencies a chance to get their business and become their agency of record. 2 of the agencies that tried out were big name firms who'd had astounding success in the past. One of them had actually helped launch Nike as a brand, and the other had helped launch the Levi Strauss 501 jeans advertising, which back in the time was a huge advertising campaign. The third agency was a local firm who had a good reputation, but they weren't really believed to be up to the task of handling such a big client. They were invited more out of a desire to be fair than because anyone thought that they were actually going to win the account. Sega asked each of these agencies to come to a pitch meeting and present their big idea for the next campaign. Now, pitch meetings in the advertising world are often big events where agencies try to offer huge and surprising pitches that can win them a client's business. And this one was no different. One of the agencies came up with this tagline for the Sega Genesis console: "Make your brain sweat." They thought this was really edgy, and they wanted to bring in an actual brain for the pitch. They couldn't get a human brain, and it was too messy to bring in an animal brain, so instead they made like one out of Jello with red vines for veins and other things embedded inside. It had this sort of weird, disgusting visual to accompany their big idea. And honestly, their idea had the right kind of tone for what Sega was looking for, but the message just wasn't very compelling, and it didn't connect to video gamers very well at all. The second firm presented a different idea, and they were actually the favored firm whom everybody was pretty sure was going to get the business. Their idea was called You Are Here, and the idea was that kids who had grown up with Nintendo were now moving on to the next stage of life where they were playing Sega now. And they wanted to make gaming a culture that they could be in control of. And they even made up this lexicon of what they called game speak that was supposed to be like a private language for gamers to use and make them feel like their own subculture. Now, of course, as someone who played a lot of video games growing up, when I heard about this idea in this book, it sounded absolutely stupid to me. And it turns out it didn't go very well with Sega either. Gamers had no need to be told by an advertising firm how to communicate with one another. The whole idea just seemed tone deaf. So the third firm, the local guys, did something amazingly impressive and different. They went out and spent a considerable amount of time conducting ethnographic research with video gamers, sending their account managers out to hang out with 8 to 10-year-old boys and learn all about their lives. They learned so much that in their pitch session, they actually recreated what a 10-year-old's bedroom looked like, right down to the smelly laundry lying on the floor. They even got involved in understanding the intricacies of the games the kids were playing, including what the kids got out of them. Now, getting to their pitch was not a slam dunk. It turned out the firm had also focus group tested several different concepts during their development phase, and they'd shown their ideas to tweens and teens, and the tweens and teens hated every concept that they were shown because they seemed like ideas that had come from old people trying to appeal to young people. The concepts felt extremely insulting and patronizing and missed the point of everything that the gamers cared about. So the agency went back to the research and realized that they had not been seeing things through the eyes of the gamers, but through their own lens as people that were trying to sell things to the gamers. And as they recalibrated their perspective, they came up with this tagline that was called "Welcome to the Next Level." They realized that this phrase was something that was authentic to gamers. It really spoke to them and what they valued about games, and then they didn't have to even create a language because that language already existed. The gamers already knew how to talk to each other. What they appreciated about gaming was progression, about mastering games, getting good at things that were challenging and fun. Playing a game was about getting to a destination, a goal at the end of something, not just playing something for a little while. And it was all there in their research. So they used this to develop this campaign, and it impressed Sega so much that they eventually went with it, and it wound up winning a lot of awards, and it helped build up an even more distinct brand image for Sega in their war against Nintendo. This was actually the best Sega ever did in the North American market. They had a long string of failures after this, which were not related to Tom Kalinske. But what impresses me most is how the agency was not only able to conduct research and use it to craft their message, but also to find a way to turn it into a story they could tell which appealed to the executives at Sega and gamers all over the nation. That's what a good presentation of qualitative research can do. And that's what I want to ensure we cover in the rest of this lecture. So when I talk about presenting qualitative research, what I'm really talking about is getting up in front of an audience and sharing information in a manner that's engaging and which understands that the audience doesn't want to hear an audiobook version of a written report. Like I said in the last lecture, they don't want a book report. They want something that connects them to the data. And whereas a report can really take the data apart and show how it all fits together, a presentation needs to instead take what's useful about the data and show how it helps to address the problem or the informational needs of the study. A good research presentation isn't about unpacking data in front of an audience like an unboxing video. It's about packaging it into something the audience is excited to see opened, so that they'll be surprised and delighted by what's inside. So once again, it's important to consider the audience for who our presentation is going to try to reach. And we have to think about, again, the level of detail that each audience needs. People that are at the ground level usually need a high level of detail. And so what we can do in a presentation is give a quick overview of the data, followed by a detailed presentation that gives a discussion or a planning session to follow so they can think about application. The same is true usually with mid-level management. They usually need a high level of data. They want high points in the presentation focused on specific objectives, and then some discussion about the salient areas of interest that they can follow up on. With department heads, they generally need more of a medium level of data. They want that high points presentation, but they also want to be able to interrupt and ask questions as you go through. And I often give them permission. I ask them, please interrupt me anytime something is not making sense to you so we can address it right away. When you get into the C-suite, that's the CEO, CMO, CFO, VP of marketing, people like that, sometimes we need a medium level of detail, sometimes a lower level of detail. And that's often where it's useful to provide an executive summary or some kind of infographic or something like that with drill downs into areas of specific interest. And this is where it's a good idea if you have a clip reel or something short that you can show that's visual. They usually like it if you have a great visual graphic that you can show, like a journey map or something like that. They're usually really helpful. And you might even consider printing those things out and giving to them ahead of time so that when you're presenting them, they've already seen them and they can ask the questions that they have. If you're talking to a board or advisory committee, I would recommend a low level of detail. And again, providing any of those really visual media as well as an executive summary, and just focusing on the high points of what was learned and what is going to happen as a result of that. Maybe even talking about how these lower levels are already working with the data to do something with them. So a few best practices to have in mind for how to present data. First of all, do find a story to tell from your data that's memorable and engaging. And we covered that in the previous lecture, but think really carefully about what story is there and how you can tell that. Do make sure you're sharing quotes from your qualitative research that illustrate your overarching story. Do provide clear, concise summaries of what you learned. Don't just talk in generalities. Make sure that what you're saying is clear and understandable, but it's summarizing it. Walk your audience through the context of your research. Help them to understand how you collected these data, what it was like, what the types of people you talked to were like, and why this information was important. Do make sure you have an encyclopedic knowledge of your data or a searchable report to refer to during your discussion. Questions are going to come up. You may need to look for keywords. You may need to look for specific comments. You may need to look for themes. And having something that you can reference while you're presenting helps a lot so that you don't have to put those questions off until later. And do be able to encourage robust discussion of your data. You need to be an expert in the data so that other people can discuss it and ask you questions about it and think about it and synthesize it and take it and form it into something that they can work with. Don't lead with method or heavy data. It's important to specify your method, but don't spend a lot of time talking about it and don't spend a lot of time focused on all of those kinds of details. And also don't overwhelm people with a bunch of data at the beginning of a presentation. It will bore them. They won't get much out of what you have to say because they're going to spend so much time being overwhelmed by trying to process what you've already shared. Don't cherry pick quotes or focus on only the most interesting or salacious or dynamic details. Instead, present things that are thematic, that really represent what you heard, not just the things that are novel and interesting. Don't spend too much time explaining data that aren't clear or which are overly nuanced. In a presentation, this is really deadly. You might get interrupted and spend 10 or 15 minutes getting derailed talking about something that isn't really that important to your research. So you have to be careful and selective about which data you do present. Don't go question by question or structure your presentation like an interview review. This is something that a lot of novice researchers do. They want to just present their data in the format that they collected it, and it unfortunately doesn't make for a very compelling or useful presentation when they do that. In fact, a lot of times you need to combine data from different questions to really get to the insights of what you have to share. Also, don't be afraid to say, I don't know. Let me get back to you on that. If somebody asks you a question that you really don't have an answer for, don't speculate and don't go off book. Just tell them that you'll get back to them. And it's okay to show your ignorance and the boundaries of where your knowledge is. Always refer back to the data. Always say, I'm not sure we have the data to talk about that, or I need to go back to the data and look and see if there are any answers about that before you put yourself out there as answering a question. And don't shut down discussion or limit questions to a brief period of time unless you absolutely have to. A lot of times discussion needs time to grow. Remember that group dynamics require people to begin thinking about how they want to respond to other people in the room before they really begin speaking up. So if you are only giving a few minutes for questions and you haven't given time for those group dynamics to come into play, the discussion and the real action that might come out of your presentation isn't going to happen. And what you're going to get instead are questions from the predictable audience members who always ask questions. They might be really smart questions that are helpful, but they might not actually allow people in your audience to really synthesize the data. I'd also like to close by reminding you that in the end, your reporting and presenting of the research are really important tasks to take seriously and do well, because often it's what you say in your report and presentation that will ultimately matter to your data end users. They're not usually going to comb through your data to see if what you said was right. They're instead going to remember what you said and trust that you represented the data fairly. And unless you give them a reason to doubt your interpretation, that's what they're going to remember and take away from your research. So be sure to stay true to your data. Share what you learned and make it count. Use these techniques that we've discussed, but always, always always go back to your data and ensure that anything you share is firmly rooted in what those data have to say. With all that said, it's time to wind down into a quick review of what we've learned, and we'll cover that in our next lecture.